So continuing on my soapbox about the legalities surrounding DeFi and all things related to DeFi. And today I want to harp on uh, lending platforms, right? And I'll start by saying, just because you don't call it a bank and you want to call it a technology, just because you want to call it say it's not a financial institution or lending institution, and say it's a protocol, doesn't mean that you don't need or aren't subject to regulation, right? And, like, just by way of background on some of these DeFi lending platforms, it's a permissionless peer-to-peer, kind of takes credit out of the equation, right? Traditional credit. And I've seen some arguments that say, well, that alone would allow the DeFi lending platform to escape regulation. And that I don't buy that. And I don't think that's accurate. And what you really come down to, and what these lending platforms really are, is a form of margin trading, right? And margin trading is you stake a certain amount of collateral, and a loan is predicated upon the size of that collateral. Well, that's lending, right? That's lending. Like, when you look at it, okay, you're posting collateral unto which you get a loan. It's at a high level a mortgage, right? At a low level, it's securities lending. And every state in the United States and nearly every country has some kind of consumer lending law, right? And if you read into the consumer lending laws, and I look at, like, say, California's, I took a look at California's in advance of this video to get a sense of how these were written and how they defined lender, you see a lot of the words, enabling words, like facilitate or make or derive. And the DeFi platform, while permissionless peer-to-peer, they're still utilizing this platform that's been provided to them, the users are. And so walking through that, I'm not able to make this loan unless I, of course, am accessing the platform. And I access the platform in various means through various channels and whatnot. But that doesn't mean that the platform itself is not subject to regulation, right? And I have a breakdown of consumer lending laws, which I'll post on my website, and you can get a sense of each state and what's exempt. And it's there's exemptions for amounts, there's exemptions related to whether interest is charged. There's a whole host of, every state is really all across the board, right? But I've done a survey for that in the past, and I'll post that to my website, my blog. But I don't think DeFi lending platforms, because they are permissionless peer-to-peer and inherently not credit-driven, don't escape that regulation. I think ultimately they should be, and as much as I don't want them to be, because I think it's a great thing, but I think the way the laws of each individual state are written right now, they in fact would be subject to state consumer lending laws. Now, commercial lending laws are a different thing. Most states don't have them. You can kind of go about and do whatever you will, subject to usury laws in a few select states. But consumer lending and peer-to-peer lending, as there are traditional fiat peer-to-peer lending platforms, you have to be licensed as a consumer lending institution in order to operate as such. And I don't think DeFi makes it any different, because it is acting as a matching service to a degree, right? And just because you're posting collateral and it's margin lending doesn't escape the definition of a loan under any state that I can find, right? So you have the platform falling under the definition of lender, right? And you have the nature of the margin loan falling on the definition of a consumer loan because it's being made to a consumer. So again, while I think it's unfortunate, and I wouldn't want it to be this way, because I think it's a great way for people to access capital and other ways for people to utilize and earn a return on wealth, right? I think ultimately it comes down to the fact that DeFi lending platforms are subject to consumer lending laws. And how those consumer lending laws work is, a state-by-state issue. And then you can go offshore, where in many cases you don't necessarily need a lending license, provided you're not providing consumer loans to people within that country, right? That within that nation. But looking at how the U.S. and Canada and others interprets their laws, making loans into the United States from offshore would subject you to U.S. regulation. Just because you're offshore, you wouldn't escape U.S. regulation, state regulation. And I would argue that it only takes one bad experience to have a regulator inquire about your business practices, right? And I think, when you're making a high volume of loans, as the promise of DeFi would suggest, that's a real possibility, even when you're doing everything right? It doesn't take much. So at the end of the day, I think for DeFi lending platforms, as decentralized and permissionless as you want it to be, you still have to bear in mind the regulation that relates to consumer loans in the state that you operate in, states that you operate in, countries that you operate in, what have you. So again, as I mentioned in my prior video about DeFi, there's competing opinions, and I'm up for debating those opinions and open to new ideas, and perhaps I can change my mind, which I wish I was wrong, to be honest with you, but I don't think I am, and that's the problem. So definitely hit me up with any questions you have, comments, what have you. Adam at AdamTracy.io. Also check out the blog, where I'll post the framework for each state's consumer lending laws, and I will talk to you soon.